Hello and welcome to this episode of StudioTech. Now, you might have guessed we're going to be looking at a camera, and this is the Sony PXW Z100. And this is a camera that Sony have kindly loaned us for the last 4 or 5 weeks. So we've had the opportunity to use it on several occasions. And the key thing about this camera is these two letters here, or number letter, 4K. This is a 4K camera. Back in 2013, Sony announced, to quite a lot of surprise, two 4K cameras, the PXW Z100 and its sort of little baby brother, the FDR AX1E. Now, these two cameras are very similar. The difference is in the codecs and the recording. The FDR AX1E basically records 50 megabits per second, whereas this camera can actually go up to 500 or 600 in 60 frames per second, megabits per second. So this is recording a lot more data. And if you're recording 4K, you want to get as much of that detail as possible. So we're going to have a quick look at the camera and we're going to show you our workflow. We just used Apple's Final Cut Pro 10. We were a little bit concerned, would our workflow work with 4K? Would we have to buy special equipment? Would we have to have a 4K monitor? But we edited with on our Mac Pro. It's a 2011 Mac Pro, high-end 2.9, 12-core machine. But we actually found that using proxy media, there was no problems in our workflow. We then transcoded it using Sorensen Squeeze. We normally use Telestream's Episode, but they don't seem to have the 4K support in place yet. So our workflow actually was pretty good, and we didn't need to buy a 4K monitor. And we uploaded to YouTube, which has 4K support. Anyway, we'll touch on that a little bit later. But let's talk about this camera. First of all, something that we often forget to talk about is the price. Now, this is not a cheap camera. It's around £4,400 in the UK plus taxes and about $5,500 in the US. But you're getting quite a lot for that. Now, you could maybe compare it to cameras like the Sony NX5. And if you have used an NX5, you'll pick this up and you'll think it's almost the same camera. And that is about 2/3 of the price. So you are paying a premium for 4K, as you would expect with this new format. So it shoots 4K, it shoots what's sort of becoming known as cinema 4K, or 4096 by 2160. That's a 17:9 format, and also shoots UHD 3840 by 2160. And that's the format that most 4K monitors and TVs will accept. Sony also calls, and other people also call that QFHD. The industry is tending to use the term UHD now for that. It doesn't just shoot in 4K, of course, though. It does shoot in 1080p up to 60 frames per second. So that is available as well. And interestingly, some of the stuff we've shot at 4K and then has been sort of transcoded to 1080 almost looks better than the original 1080, and there are some technical reasons for that we're not going to go into, but do a search out there on that if you're interested. So the recording format is XAVC. This was first brought to the market by Sony with their PMW F55. And that, as I mentioned earlier, records at 500 megabits per second if you're shooting at 50 frames per second, or 600 megabits per second if you're shooting at 60, or I guess I should say 59.94 for those living in NTSC land. It records onto XQD cards, and when we have a quick tour of the camera, we'll look at those slots. Now, talking about those XQD cards, before we give it a tour, this camera has got a 32 gigabyte card in it. Now, when you're shooting HD, you think you've got 32 gig. Well, that is pretty good. But on this, shooting in 4K, that only lasts about 12 minutes. So one of the things you do have to think about is how many XQD memory cards that you need. You need very fast memory for this. In a future upgrade, they are going to support an AVC HD with an SDHC card. The slot is there, but I haven't been able to find out when that upgrade is going to be available. I don't think it's available at the moment. So let's have a closer look at the camera. So a quick tour around the camera. One of our favourite features on any camera these days is the lens cover. This is a switch and not the old cap. A G series lens. This is the same lens as used on other cameras. Great lens, and we very much like this. This is a fixed lens. You can't change it. Obviously, 3-ring operation. You've then got some assignable buttons at the top. 3 of them are pre-assigned for zebra, peaking and thumbnails, but you can reassign them. 3 different neutral density filters. We were shooting outside this morning, so we've been using the neutral density filter. Auto, manual focus, and push for auto when you're in manual mode. Audio controls, and down the side here there are buttons for operating the menus if you're using the viewfinder. And there's a sort of select and set rotary button there, and you can press it to select something. Underneath you've got gain, white balance, and a shutter speed control. So that is the side of the camera. On the top you have the fold out LED screen. And there are some buttons on the top for adjusting that. So you can either use the screen with these buttons, or you can use the eyepiece with these buttons for going through the menus. There is a rocker zoom here, as well as on the handle grip. So going around to the back then, and we'll open up this cover here, and you can see that there are 2 XQD card slots. We just have a XQD 32 gigabyte card in. This is the S series. This is 180 megabytes per second. This will capture it, and that is why that you need. You obviously need that, and they are reasonably expensive, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. There's the SD card slot, currently not in use. 2 USB connectors. And you can actually use this. This can be controlled remotely. It has a sort of, you connect to it with a phone, a smartphone or an iPad, etc. And through a web interface, you can actually remotely control the camera. You then have the battery, and then a series of connectors. And it's always amazing to see that you've got the old, yellow phono RCA jacks for video out, composite video, and right and left audio. Even on 4K cameras, you have that. You have an HDMI port, and you have another SDHC card slot. This is for recording the settings of the camera, so you can back up the settings and transfer those to another camera. Now the HDMI port does support up to 60 frames per second, and Sony have said that a firmware upgrade will give it the full HDMI 2.0 capability, so which is good. So it's not a 1.3 or 1.4 camera, so 1.4 is limited to 25 or 30 frames per second. This will actually give you 60 frames up to 60 frames per second plugged into an appropriate TV, such as Sony Bravia 4K. Then we have, you have time code, and then of course you have, you have SDI on the left, and then we have time code on the right. Now the SDI, does give you full, 10-bit 422 output, but it's only HD. It's not 4K. But if you're recording in 4K, you can get an HD output, so you can record an HD feed onto something like Atomos Samurai, etc., field recorder, or you can take that into a studio link. And then swinging obviously the eyepiece at the top. So the viewfinder is 0.45 inch, 852 by 480, 16:9 viewfinder, and turning the camera around. Got the grip, the power on/off buttons, and you have remote connector here for land C, focus magnifier, zoom. You've got an iris push button, two XLR connectors for audio, and just under here there's a flap for selecting the various audio options. And we've got a microphone mounted, and that's it. Except at the front, of course, you have got a microphone there as well, so you can use this omnidirectional stereo electret condenser microphone if you want to, if you haven't got another microphone connected. So that's a quick look around the camera. Now, if you're used to Sony cameras and you looked at that, you'll probably think, well, I understand that camera. We just picked this up and used it without any problem at all. Very similar to the NX5 and the 155, 200, etc. Really nice camera, and a nice G lens on it. So let's now look at the workflow. We went out and shot some video outside, just of some plants to give you an idea. And we're not going to include that video here in this video. We're going to publish those separately, because one of them is going to be in 4K and one of them is going to be in HD. And you can look at those, because this is being shot just in HD, so it wouldn't have been fair to include them in it. So do look for those two clips. But let's just have a quick look at how the workflow was and the operation in Final Cut Pro 10. We shot test clips on the PXW Z100 in both 4K and in HD. And we've created two little videos which are on YouTube, which you can look at when you've finished watching this video. Here's the first one. This is the HD clip. And if I move, I'm in Final Cut Pro 10 here, and you can see there's no problem at all with moving along the timeline. We were expecting some potential slowdown with the 4K version, but if I switch to 4K, we actually found that it was just as responsive. Now, we did create, proxy media when we were importing, which of course helps a lot with this. But we found that our, thoughts that we might have problems with the workflow really were unfounded. All we had to do was go to the Sony website, include a driver which helps convert the files from the camera. We plugged the camera in using a USB and just went up to the normal file import mode, imported them from the PXW Z100 without any problems at all. Obviously, the 4K clips are a lot larger, so you do have to allow some time for that import. And the same with export. Sharing takes a little bit longer. But the actual editing really was pretty quick, so we were very pleased with the overall workflow. Now, as I said, the two video clips are on YouTube already. Now, we have shot some other stuff in 4K. Our StudioTech UK studio tour is on the website, and that's actually in 4K, shot with the PXW Z100. And soon we will be releasing a studio tour of the US studio, also shot with the PXW Z100 in 4K. So the two clips to look for are called Sony PXW Z100 Test Clip 4K and Sony PXW Z100 Test Clip HD. If I just go to this particular clip, you can see that it is playing. These are shot in 25p, and if we go to settings, you'll see that available all the way from 144p up to 2160 in 4K. So what you can do is to look at this particular clip, the 4K clip. I would suggest watching that in 4K if you can, but if not, watch it in HD, and then go and compare that to the HD clip being played in HD. We have found that some of the down converted 4K footage actually looks better than native HD footage. So see what you think. So check out those two files. So from a workflow perspective, we didn't have to buy any equipment and our infrastructure just worked as it was, and we were pleased with that. So do check out those two videos. The HD video has two clips in it. The first is shot on manual, the second is shot on auto. The 4K video has three clips in it. The first two clips are almost identical to the HD. The shots are taken of the same plants, etc. And again, the first one is in manual and the second one is in automatic. And there's an additional third clip there of a nice poppy that was in the garden that we thought we would zoom in on. So check those out. Now, what do we think of the camera? We need to summarize what we have thought about it. So let's think about the negatives first of all. Now, if you want to shoot in low light, the camera is not that great in low light. Like many cameras at the beginning of the HD sort of evolution, the low light performance wasn't great. The sensors, they have to improve as they develop them. It's not saying that it's bad, but it is not great. They quote 3 lux as needed at 25 shutter speed of a 25th. Now the sensor in this camera is one chip. It's a 1/2.3 back illuminated Exmor-R CMOS sensor. So it's a single sensor chip. And you are going to get some noise in low light. That is just unavoidable. If you want to use this in a 4K studio environment, then this probably isn't the camera to get. And it's not designed for use in a studio. You want 4K output, as we've mentioned, you have to use the HDMI. There isn't an SDI 4K output. And to be fair to Sony, the industry really hasn't decided what is going to be the interface. Is it going to be 6G SDI, but then of course you're limited to 25 frames per second or 30 frames per second, which is fine for our use, for that's what we produce mainly for the internet. You can't support 60 frames per second over 6G. It's just not fast enough. And for that, you need 12G, and hardly anybody is using 12G as yet, though the components are just starting to come along. There's another interface, which is the quad SDI, 4 3G SDI outputs, splits the screen basically into 4 quadrants and puts them back together. So 3 gigabit gives you the 12 gigabit or 12G that you need. So until the industry sort of decides on a standard, you're on the bleeding edge of technology. So for 4K studio use, unless you're going to want to use HDMI 2 when Sony shipped the firmware update, then this isn't for you. And the last negative is really the price of the XQD memory cards. As I mentioned earlier, you do get through these memory cards pretty quickly. When we were shooting one of our videos, it was only a 10-minute video, and we actually had to offload various B-roll, etc. from the memory card, put the memory card back in, and then film the next bit. And it was a bit of a pain because we only have the one card. And the cards are not cheap. So you can see here on the graphic the various recording times for a 64 gigabyte XQD memory card, and give you an idea of how many that you will need for the shoots that you are going to do. Now, I give it to Sony. Sony have done a good job. Fast memory, is not easily available. There are other technologies coming along, such as CFast, but they haven't yet really stepped up to the plate and delivered the pricing and performance that is needed. So, with XQD, you can record, in quality, without risk, 500 or 600 megabits per second. So well done, Sony. But obviously, with the low production runs that they do, then the pricing is that bit higher. So do bear that in mind when you're pricing up your camera, the number of cards that you will need. So really, that's it for the negatives. How about for the positives? Well, 4K. It's got 4K. That's great. I mean, that is its real positive. And we have been really impressed with the 4K, and not just us. The videos that we have posted and video that we have shown people have really been impressed. So it's great. And I am now from, being a little bit of a, oh, well, who wants 4K? I'm now becoming a bit of a 4K proponent, and I think it is going to be great. So it's got 4K. That's obviously a big positive. The down-converted 4K to HD seems to look better than the native HD. There are various technical papers out there on the internet that I've been reading to try and understand it. And if you want more information on that, do a search. But it is, a benefit that I hadn't expected at all. I guess the third positive is that we get the normal Sony quality of camera, the great G-series lens. If you're used to Sony cameras, this will be, a joy for you to use. They are always a pleasure to use. So that's it, positives and negatives. Now, a question we get asked a lot is, would we buy this camera? I think the answer is, if we were looking for a camera for out of studio use, I would be really interested in this camera. But most of our work is in studio. So because of the problems with the lack of a 4K standard and the HDMI 4K output, then I don't think we would get this camera. But for outside use, I certainly would be interested. The comments have been amazing. So that's it. That's our look at the PXW Z100. I hope you've enjoyed that. Do check out all our other videos. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is StudioTech TV. We also do a weekly live stream. That's every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. UK, 2000 CET. And you can find that at live.studiotech.tv. And one of the really nice things about that is that there is a great community developing in a team room who come together and help each other out, help us out, answer the questions that we can't answer, as well as give us some challenging questions from week to week. So it is a great community. So do try and join us one Tuesday for that. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this. You can follow me on Twitter at TTFNTV. We don't tweet very often, so please follow me on Twitter. I hope you'll come back and watch another episode of Studio Tech soon. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.